mic'd here, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
Because there's nobody in the room, it's just echoing, I guess.
so having not been requested to produce any new information between when this was presented to council, I'm just going to give a maybe somewhat more expansive version of the presentation that accompanied that, and then take any questions or direction that the committee would like to give. So the origin of this was a request from Mayor McFarland back last summer to talk about how the UDO could better facilitate areas that are transitioning from residential to commercial use, but still have office buildings that fit within a residential context. This was also something that was discussed but not really acted upon as part of the Cameron Village Hillsborough plan, particularly looking at areas like Vanderbilt Street and Maiden Lane as part of that planning effort. As part of this effort, we realized that it was very closely related to the topic of missing middle housing, which is higher density housing that fits in with a lower scale residential context. And the reason why it's similar is that both office buildings as well as multifamily are more intense uses that are not typically found in modern single family zoning districts, but they used to be in the pre-zoning era, found in residential neighborhoods, and were often developed to a scale. And this shows one historic example in the photograph in the middle bottom of a fourplex that's located in historic Oakwood. It also includes a small duplex in the lower right and some examples of some townhouses up top. And there is this terminology, it's big within the new urbanist movement right now, talking about missing middle housing, and that's that sort of gentler density that lies between the detached single family dwelling and the larger apartment building. And right now in the UDO, this is a major gap in how we zone. So on the left end of this, we have R10. R10 covers our smaller lot single family neighborhoods. It does permit the apartment building type, but you have to have a lot of 10,000 square feet, which is larger than most of the lots in older neighborhoods. And then we have the RX and OX districts. They permit office uses and multifamily residential. And they can be assigned a height as low as 3 stories, but they don't have any density caps. And so the highest and best use typically under an RX district is something bigger. So in between, you could do the missing middle housing in an RX district, but you could also do something denser than that. In general, you couldn't do classic missing middle housing in R10 because most of those housing types are denser than 10 units per acre. So for example, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, which is the minimum for an apartment building within an R10 district, if you put even a triplex on it, you've broached 10 units per acre. So the density is effectively limiting the ability to accommodate those types of uses on smaller lots. So when we looked at how to accommodate both of these types of uses, the residentially scaled office as well as the missing middle housing within the ordinance, there are a couple options, one of which is we could pursue a new zoning district, which is a fairly heavy lift, or we could look to reuse tools that are already in the code but through a text change process. And so we have this frontage that can be applied to mixed use districts detached, that the intent statement spoke directly to this whole residential office idea. It said it was intended for areas adjacent to roadways transitioning from residential to commercial, accommodates neighborhood scale, low intensity commercial uses while maintaining the residential character of the street right of way. And when you look at where this was mapped, the largest single area, let's see if I can get a little pointer here, is there in the North Boylan neighborhood where we have a lot of historic houses that have been converted to commercial use over the years. And we also see it up on the edges of Oakwood and Edendon Street and down in South Park where we mapped detached frontage where there was higher density or more intensive uses, but it was primarily detached buildings. So that's what it was intended for. The issue is that the standards as currently drafted don't fully meet the intent and that they don't actually guarantee that you'll get detached buildings. So While you can't do general or mixed-use buildings, so it means the generic office building couldn't be built, or a building that had retail and office in it couldn't be built. It does prohibit parking between the building and the street, so you can't have front yard parking. It does require that long walls be offset, but if you're willing to do the offsets, you can have buildings of any horizontal dimension. So for example, under detached frontage, I could, if I had an entire block to develop, put an apartment building that filled up the entire block as long as I articulated the wall, or I could put up a row of townhouses that filled the entire block without interruption. So that's not really necessarily the type of scale that people think about with the word detached, because there's nothing necessarily detached about a block-long building face. There's also no requirement for a side yard.
Why can you do that under detached frontage?
That's just a quirk of how it's currently drafted. There's nothing prohibiting you from doing it under the current standards.
So why wouldn't you just do townhomes?
Why wouldn't you do townhomes?
I mean, if you said if you had a whole block and you wanted to put a series of townhomes on, you could put the whole series of townhomes
That's right.
on under detached frontage. Why wouldn't you just build them as townhomes?
There'd be no particular reason why not to.
Okay.
So, based on that, staff has identified some potential changes to the detached frontage that would cause there to be more separation between buildings. The first two are to cap the size of any single building, both in terms of the total square footage within the building and the maximum building footprint. So the numbers we've come up with were 3,000 and 8,000. Why were these particular numbers chosen? I think that they, in terms of looking at historic antecedents for multifamily residential and detached setting, the most we've ever seen is 6 units. You could do 6 reasonably sized units in an 8,000 square foot building. A 3,000 square foot footprint would correspond to a fairly large one-story single-family house. So that was sort of the origin of these numbers. There's nothing magic about them, and they were sort of starting points for conversation. Adding a side yard requirement that doesn't currently exist was another idea. A fourth idea was to put a limit of how many townhouses could be in an attached row. Maximum lot width is an idea that would require land to be subdivided, so you couldn't just do one big parcel. Staff is not convinced that's necessary if you do the building size and building footprint, but it's another concept that we put out there. Potentially lowering the height limit to match what's prevailing in the R10 zone for attached and townhouse and apartment building types, and then potentially looking at sign limits so that if you're introducing commercial use within a residential context, that you have some extra standards for how large signs could be.
What's the height limit in DE now?
50 feet across the board.
In R10, it's
You can't do DE in R10. This would be DE attached to a mixed-use district such as RX, OX, or NX. So none of this affects R10 today. None of what I'm talking about affects R10. If we wanted to affect R10, that would be something totally different than this particular proposal.
okay. So
Or you'd have to remap R10 to something else.
so where's just trying to be clear. We're still talking about commercial use.
We're talking about commercial use and multifamily use. Multifamily being defined as 3 or more units in a single structure.
Okay. So when we talk about addressing the missing middle, which is kind of what we're talking about,
Yeah.
you're talking about that only being in a mixed-use district?
Well, that's one proposal. If we wanted to address it in a residential district, there would be 2 things you'd have to get at. One of which is what is the minimum lot size for the use, and the second is you would have to allow greater density than 10 or 6 units per acre in R10 and R6. I think when we go to the example of Asheville, it'll make that a little bit clearer about how they do it, but what the implications of the Asheville model are is very different from our model.
Okay.
All those things would get at detached buildings and limitations on building size and scale. You could also consider other aspects of residential character. People usually associate a pitched roof with something that looks like a house, although there's obviously modern houses that do not have pitched roofs. So, putting a standard requiring a pitched roof would let out certain types of architectural treatments, but certainly communities have done that. Looking at building materials would be another thing, and then you could also think about building elements. We're not constrained by the design controls bill because we're not talking about buildings that are built under the 1 and 2 family residential code. So you could require that they have a porch or a gable or a dormer or some other thing that's typically found in residential architecture and less so in commercial architecture. Staff would consider these optional add-ons, but we put them in there just to give a full accounting of the options for consideration. So if you took D and combined it with an OX3 district, you would have a district that would work really well for an area like North Boylan, which has a lot of detached residential structures that have been converted to office uses, and it would now accommodate new construction that would be of that scale. If you combine it with an RX3 district, you would make it easier to do higher density, small scale multifamily, such as duplexes on small lots, triplexes, quadruplexes. There's a term in some circles called mansion apartments, and basically they're apartment buildings that look like a big mansion. From the exterior, they achieve that by having one door, and the doors to the apartments are the interior, so it just looks like a big house, but inside there's multiple units. So that's the type of thing that you would typically see in a fourplex. If you're in New England, you see triple deckers. There are 3 units stacked on top of each other. There's lots of different typologies depending on what region of the country you're in. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, because when this was originally brought up, the chair of this committee, who's absent today, had asked staff to do some research as to how Asheville zones for infill development in missing middle. And what they do is very interesting. This give a little bit of background. They have essentially 6 flavors of residential zoning. They have RS, which is residential single family, and it comes with 3 different minimum lot sizes. And then they have RM, which is residential multifamily, and it comes with 3 different lot sizes. And they do not have units per acre in their residential zoning district. The density is set by the minimum lot size. So let me just explain that difference. In an R10 district, the minimum lot size for a detached house is 4,000 square feet. However, I also have a cap of 10 units per acre. So if I had an 8,500 square foot lot, I could not split it in 2 because the effective density of the subdivision would exceed 10 units per acre. In Asheville, you could do that because they don't have the units per acre. The other side is that the reason why the lot size in R10 is smaller than the number of feet in an acre divided by 10 is because in a larger scale subdivision, you're laying out common area and streets, which typically are 15 to 20% of it. So you want to provide flexibility. You could get to the 10 units per acre while still laying out streets. But so in Asheville, you couldn't subdivide below the minimum lot size in a larger subdivision. So it giveth, from the standpoint of small scale subdivisions, taketh away in terms of large scale subdivisions, in terms of what the achievable density is. In a small scale subdivision, the achievable density is that lot size divided into the number of square feet into an acre, vice versa, sorry, an acre divided by that lot size in square feet. In a large scale subdivision, it's the same thing. So, which would effectively, because you have to set aside land for other stuff such as streets and common areas, would be a lesser effective density than in a small scale subdivision. So that's one thing they do. The other thing that they did was they allowed, I just want to see if I have another. They recently changed their ordinance to say if you can put a single family house on a lot in an RM district, you can also put a duplex, because they had already allowed accessory dwelling units. So they said, well, we're already allowing 2 units, 1 accessory, why don't we just allow 2 units? So for example, in the RM8 district, there's a minimum lot size of 4,000 square feet. You can put a duplex as well as a single family house on that. And every additional 1,000 square feet of lot area you add gets you another unit. So you can put a triplex on 5,000 square feet. You can put a quadruplex on 6,000 square feet. You can put a sixplex on 8,000 square feet. This gets you into density ranges of 20, 30 units per acre. At the high end, a sixplex on the minimum lot in the RM16 district would be over 40 units an acre. Whether you could fit all that along with required parking, I'm not 100% sure, but theoretically, if you could fit it, it would be possible to have that level of density. So they're allowing much more density in their residential RM zones than we are. Now, we don't have the same equivalent type of zoning scheme. We go from R1 through R10, which are fairly conventional residential districts, to all of a sudden RX, where there's a height limit, but density is unlimited, and that is a totally different, it's a very different approach. But I would say that just looking at the map, it appears that about a third of the residential zoning in Asheville citywide is in an RM district. So it's a not insignificant amount of neighborhood fabric is zoned in one of these RM districts. At the top of the table, they also did the same thing we proposed. I wasn't aware of this until we looked it up. They proposed a building footprint max of 4,000 and a maximum building size of 12,000 to make sure that people wouldn't assemble large tracts of land to do larger apartment buildings in their RM zones. But these are bigger numbers than we had proposed in our original thinking. So the summary of this presentation is that the detached frontage was really originally designed for residential scale commercial use. The current standards, we think, would better fulfill that goal with some enhancement, which would probably make it easier to map detached in more places than it is today. And that if we made those types of amendments, it would also end up being useful for zoning for missing middle housing. Now, the proviso, of course, is that there's not much detached frontage on the map. You would have to find places to map this for it to have any impact. So the tool would be there in the ordinance, but it wouldn't be making any major difference unless there was more areas were mapped with this tool. And of course, that can happen through one of two ways. Someone can petition for it, or the city can just initiate it. So with that, we would think that at least as a start, that these amendments are worthwhile. If nothing else, they would potentially improve development outcomes in areas that are currently mapped, detached. And of course, we're already at the next step of talking about this in committee. So I would be happy to answer any further questions on the topic.
So with the changes in minimum lot size and everything that was in that last chart,
right,
is how you could apply this detached frontage to address the missing middle in a residential area. Is that what you're saying, or?
Yeah, I mean, again, detached has to go along with a mixed-use district. So in an area that's currently zoned RX or OX, and you apply the detached frontage, it would give you this type of outcome. But if we're talking about areas that might have a different zoning, like a residential zoning, you want to use this tool, that area would have to be rezoned. So I'll just give a specific example. As part of, where this was talked about was Vanderbilt Street, and it was one of the locations that was talked about, Vanderbilt Street, as part of the Hillsborough Street plan. And there was a lot of back and forth discussion about, you had a street that had a mixture of, we all good here? Okay, great. It had a mixture of single family and multifamily use there, and there was a thought from some folks that it would be good to allow small scale office to occupy some of those structures, or to allow some new structures to fit in. But there was concern that we didn't have a zoning tool that was tailored to that. So this is a zoning tool that could be applied, but to use it, you would have to take the existing R6 zoning, and by the way, a lot of the use on Vanderbilt Street is currently non-conforming under R6. Right. You would have to remap it to an RX3 DE or an OX3 DE in order to make that happen. How would you do a remapping for an area like that? I mean, ideally, if it was done by the city, it should be an implementation item in an area plan where you've done a public process and said, this is the direction we want to go in. And instead of just putting it as a policy recommendation and inviting individual property owners to come in and remap. You would actually go in and say, we think this is a good idea. We want to open up this area to the market for this type of investment, and we're going to go ahead and put the zoning on the ground as an implementation item.
So-
That is not something that we have done very often.
Right.
And of course, we did it on a large scale with the UDO remapping, but that was more replacing old districts. But it is an option that's available to the city council should you ever decide to exercise it.
So what is the holdback from being able to do that same thing if something's zoned R10?
So again, there's
If
I think
somebody
there's
wanted to put a duplex or triplex on,
okay. So right now, if you want to put a triplex in R10, you need a 10,000 square foot lot. I mean, just to consider multifamily, and then you can't breach 10 units per acre. So in general, a lot of these, when people talk about missing middle, they're really talking about stuff that's denser than 10 units per acre. And you know, again, we're not talking about a lot of units. You know,
Right.
you've got a quarter acre, you know, you've got a tenth of an acre lot. You don't need to put much on there to, you know, I mean, 10,000 square feet is a little shy of a quarter of an acre lot. You put 4 units on there, and you're already breaching
Right.
the 10 units per acre. So effectively, I think that the current standards, both the density limits and the minimum lot sizes, make it hard to do what people typically think of as missing middle, which is something that's significantly denser than the surroundings, but from the external viewpoint looks very similar.
okay.
So on Vanderbilt Street particularly, where this first came up, most of the houses there, I'm assuming, are more in the 1,500 to 2,000, 2,500 square feet. So if we went to an 8,000 square foot, what impact do you think that might have? I mean, would people then start tearing down the houses to build, you know, larger structures?
I mean, it's possible. We would have to, again, look at what sort of standards we wanted to put on there, and you would still have to meet yard and setback requirements. But yes, if you provide an option to put something much more valuable in the place of what exists, someone's going to take you up on that. Now, remember that in a redevelopment scenario, the land is both the land and the structure that's on it and the cost of demolishing it. So, and the structure in most cases is not worthless. It adds some value. So that means that the thing that replaces it can't be a little bit more valuable. It has to be a lot more valuable because, you know, even in a very high land cost environment, that's still 20 to 25% of the basis of the project. So that would mean that the thing that you were putting in its place should be at least 4 times more valuable than the cost of acquiring the land and the building. So, you know, it has to be a fairly sizable increment.
So we really need to decide what our objective is here, because if we're, for instance, trying to save the houses that are on Vanderbilt and just repurpose them,
Right.
if we were to do something like this, chances are the houses would go away. Maybe they'd be replaced with missing middle housing, which might be a good thing too, but it sort of depends on what we're trying to accomplish, right?
Yes.
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I brought it up because I was looking for something that would be usable in transitioning from a more intense business district to
Right.
residential, but if it also provides an opportunity that we don't have, I mean, that looked like a pretty big chunk that we're missing
Yeah.
in the UDO when it comes to affordability and the potential to look at how we do housing in different ways.
Right. And again, we've sort of, you know, scratched the surface of what is possible. So in the old code, we had more residential districts. We had R20 and we had R30.
Right.
You know, we could think about resurrecting an R zone that allows higher density. But again, if we did that, it wouldn't exist anywhere on the zoning map, and it would only come into play if it were mapped somewhere.
Now, this piece that Asheville does around, if you can put a single-family home on a lot, you can put a duplex.
Yeah.
Is that a way to work within our current zoning regulations?
Well, I mean, so that could be done essentially by dropping, you would have, you would have to drop the minimum lot size for what's called an attached dwelling to match that of a single-family dwelling. But you would still, again, you couldn't exceed the 6 units, 10 units per acre that are currently in the R6, unless we decide to change that and go to something. One of the things about the Asheville model is that they were able to do all this by simply changing the minimum lot requirements for different dwelling unit types, right? So, because they didn't have to worry about units per acre, because it wasn't saying they were regulating in their residential districts at all. But that, again, would be a significant change because of the concern about lot splits. You would now be allowing lot splits to occur on lots where it currently isn't permitted. How many of those are there that fall within that range between what's permitted under density and what would be permitted if you go to the minimum lot size? It's kind of hard to say. You know, it's probably not an enormous number, but it's enough of a number that, you know, I could imagine certain neighborhoods for whom lot splits are a concern would tend to be worried about that. So that would be another thing about going to the Asheville model that we would have to think about.
And what sort of results did they get in terms of increased density and that sort of thing?
That's a bit of research we're still working on. The standards are pretty new, so I don't know if they've been in place long enough for there to been first have a good gauge of what the market response was to the change in the ordinance. I would be surprised if they don't see something. But you know, the interesting thing is there's a general thought that it's always that people want to max out the density. I don't know if that's always the case. I mean, in my neighborhood, just down the street, someone took a legal non-conforming duplex and converted it to a single family. So they lost forever the ability to have a duplex there under the R10 zoning. But they were willing to do that because they thought the house was more valuable if it was one big house as opposed to two smaller houses, which is kind of interesting. But, you know, clearly, when you're in an environment of rising land costs, and rising land values, in order to justify those high land costs, you either need a really large and luxurious single-family house, or you need multiple units. I mean, that's the thing. So you got a 200,000 square foot lot, you need an 800,000 or better house on top of it. So that's either 4 $200,000 houses or it's one $800,000 house. So I mean, those are the things that I think are facing these older neighborhoods and why they're seeing so much pressure for tear downs. Clearly, even keeping the zoning in place has not stopped the trend towards tearing down smaller structures and putting up bigger structures, even when there's no increase in density at all. You know, the case of Vanderbilt Street is interesting because there's a mix of multifamily and single family on there today, and the building sizes vary. Some of the multifamily, which predates the current zoning scheme, you know, probably is larger in size than the single family. Most of the single family there is not very large. You know, and so I think clearly if you change the R6 zoning, you would probably be unleashing something in the area given the demand for housing in that area.
I was going to ask. Well, I mean, I think the DE already, obviously, the whole office looks more residential, seems to be
Right.
pretty much addressed, unless we want to add some things like the building characteristics, pitch, roof, or building materials or architectural elements. That's the real question is, how do we, oh, I know what it was. So there are duplexes now around town. How are they built? Or what zoning, is it just determined by the size of the lot? If the lot's big enough to have.
A lot of those duplexes are old. They predate the current zoning. A lot of the neighborhoods around downtown used to be zoned much higher. Remember Special R30 on Glenwood, Brooklyn?
Yeah.
I mean, that was a
there's
legacy of the
some in
fact
North
that
Raleigh too, I'm just saying.
A lot of the in-town neighborhoods were zoned R20 and R30. So, you know, and that was just back in the 50s and 60s. And so some of the duplexes we see, but I haven't seen much in the way of modern duplexes going up in any of these neighborhoods, and it's partly because the minimum lot size doesn't gracefully allow it, and the density doesn't gracefully allow it.
Well, you know, unless we figure out a way to start increasing the density somewhere, then the housing prices are just gonna continue to go up even faster than they are, so you know, welcome your suggestions for how you think best we can help make that happen.
So staff thinks this is a start. It addresses the original issue that was brought up. I mean, if you wanted to, when we're talking about office uses specifically, you need an OX district. And so this is a kinder, gentler OX district. You know, when you use this frontage, that would be appropriate for many areas. When we start thinking about how can we increase the density in the R zones, that is a different conversation for which we would need to bring back some different options, but and do some thinking about it. But it's something we would certainly be happy to report back to this committee on that topic.
Yeah. And one last question, and that is cottage court. How does that work? Are you still within the existing zoning if you're doing a cottage court development in an R10 area? Do you still have to stay within the 10 units, or is there?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
So there's a minimum size for a cottage court and a maximum density. So you're getting maybe a different kind of layout, but you're not necessarily getting more density with the cottage court. This was obviously something we talked about in the context of tiny homes.
Right.
But if we wanted to start, you know, if we wanted to start allowing that greater density, again, we would have to make some tweaks to the R zones, and maybe one of those tweaks would be how we deal with density when you're putting more than one unit on a lot, which would be potentially one way to protect the issue of lot splits, saying we're still going to, on the subdivision codes, on the subdivision side, not allow you to split lots that breach the units per acre. However, if you're looking at some of these other housing types, we would maybe confer some additional density when that was on a single lot. That would be we'd have to give this some thought and do some research, but that would be one way to potentially look at it.
I have one other question. When Asheville did the thing where they let people build duplexes where before it had been single-family homes, was the community generally supportive of that? Well, how did that play out?
Well, we weren't really there for the process, but I did have some staff talk to some folks up there. And the interesting thing is that, you know, apparently there was a fair amount of reasonable, I mean, they did not enact it in the face of significant opposition from what we heard. I mean, I'm sure there were concerns, and we're, again, I think doing a little bit more research about it, because when we learned about what Asheville had done and how they regulated it, we thought it was an intriguing model. Not sure it's right for Raleigh, but it was certainly worth looking at. You know, they are facing I think, affordability issue that's more acute than ours, and therefore we're willing to go further with the solutions. The other interesting thing was this whole idea of allowing an additional unit for every 1,000 increment up in lot size was something they resurrected from the code in the 40s. This was something they had done some research in their archives as to how the zoning used to work, and that was a provision in the code that went way back. And so essentially they were resurrecting something that had been in effect at the time many of these neighborhoods were built. Because Asheville was a much more built-out city than Raleigh was in 1940. Raleigh was just getting started in the 1940s. We were a pretty small town then. You know, as I like to say, you know, over 2/3 of Raleigh is built since 1980. I mean, it's really new. It's a really new fabric. It's very different from a city that had a big growth spurt in the pre-war period like Asheville did, and then kind of leveled off.
So when you said that they added an additional unit for 1,000 feet, whatever, is that both attached and detached, or was that just for one or the other?
It was for any. I mean, you can keep going up in increments. You know, add another 1,000 square feet, get another unit. Now, eventually, you'll run into that building size cap, right? That 12,000 square foot cap, or you may run into some other constraint. There's still parking requirements.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you're doing surface parking, that takes up room. So you may get to a point that, you know, you can no longer fit the theoretically maximum allowable number of units under the envelope on the site and accommodate the off-street parking and side yards and other regulations. We haven't done that modeling. That's a more difficult question. And again, we're hoping to avoid doing that work by just asking Asheville how they think do it.
So the one you showed us in Oakwood, you couldn't build that today?
Oh, no, absolutely not.
Okay.
I mean, I think recollection serves that That's just on a pretty standard sized lot and probably breaches 20 units to the acre. So, well, so unless the historic, I don't think the historic zoning gets you out of density. You know, you can do an NCOD that could do this, but of course, most of our NCODs have gone in the other direction
Yes.
in terms of restricting density. But it is theoretically possible to use an NCOD to allow more density than the underlying code would permit.
Okay, so I think we would like to hear back some more on residential use. What about the DE? Any decisions you need us to make today to move forward on that, or?
It is what it is, and it's already there.
Right. Well, I would say, given that the full membership of the committee is not here today, it sounds like that idea is seen as a step in the right direction, but maybe not enough. So if that's the case, what I think would be good for us to come back with a more fully fleshed out proposal for what that text change would look like.
Okay.
That would give something more tangible to report back to the full council. And we can also, we'll have a little bit more research about Asheville's model under our belts, and then we can talk maybe a little bit more, be a little bit more prepared to talk about if we wanted to start tweaking the standards in some of the residential zones, what that might look like, and provide some options and present on that. And I probably would like to have about 4 weeks to do that.
That's fine. Okay, any other questions or requests?
Thank you.
Got that, Ralph? Okay, if nothing else, then meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.